It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of high-definition graphics. It was the age of muted tones. It was the season of innovation. It was the season of imitation. It was the spring of creativity. It was the winter of stagnating genres. In short, the period was so far like the present period, with far too few creative risks taken in the AAA space, and no AA titles to explore the unknown. But there is one aspect of history I'm thankful we aren't repeating. We called it the Great JRPG Drought of the 7th Generation. Between the years of 2006 and 2009, very few JRPGs were released on home consoles, especially compared to the number we'd gotten during the previous 2 console generations. The few JRPGs that did seem to be releasing were doing their best to stray away from the traditional turn-based style, because the powers that be arbitrarily decided that they didn't sell well enough anymore. You all remember, right? It was that weird era where the Tales series finally started getting popular in America because it had virtually no competition. Calm down, Tales fans, I'm a fan too. Tales of Eternia is the best one. Publishers felt there was no room in the market for niche titles anymore, not when development costs for the Xbox 360 and PS3 were so high. We gamers knew the truth, of course, that the publishers were wrong. JRPGs could still be hot sellers. We just had to have one game released to high enough sales to prove it. Off on the horizon was one glimmering ray of hope. The hero returning from a 3-year-long exile to take back its throne, destined to forge a path so that other JRPGs may once again have a spot on the shelves of game stores across the land. In 2009, Final Fantasy XIII released, and it was a piece of shit. In 2009, Final Fantasy XIII released, and it sold incredibly well, proving that JRPGs could still be a huge hit on home consoles, and ensuring that we would get more JRPGs in the future. But while sales were high, the reception was mixed. Final Fantasy XIII received high marks from critics, but heavily divided the series' fanbase, with one of the most common complaints from the detractors, valid or not, being that it felt nothing like a Final Fantasy game. This context is necessary because many fans thought that Final Fantasy had failed them, and they were begging for a return to form. Something with a classic fantasy story, turn-based gameplay, something that could scratch their nostalgic itch while still being something they'd never played before. Lucky for those fans, Square had announced Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, known as Final Fantasy Gaiden in Japan, which isn't to be confused with Final Fantasy Adventure, which was also titled Final Fantasy Gaiden in Japan. And Square, why are you always so bad at naming things? The game wasn't being released on home consoles, so it wasn't the true HD Final Fantasy experience that many had been hoping for, but diehard fans who didn't like the series' new direction had nowhere else left to turn. And the game looked promising. It was being developed by Matrix Software, the same team who had previously helmed the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 remakes on the DS, which were both pretty solid interpretations of their source material. They also cited Final Fantasy V and its class system as the main inspiration for Four Heroes gameplay. Reading over their dev blog showed how enthusiastic the team was about the project. It wasn't a cash grab, it was a labor of love, and fans of the series had a lot of reason to be excited for it. The game launched in the US in 2010 with tepid scores, especially by mainstream review standards, but I'm here to tell you that I disagree with the game's overall reception, because it was far too forgiving. Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light is less a throwback to NES and SNES era Final Fantasy titles, and more a guide on how not to make an RPG. If nothing else, I feel that aesthetically the game holds true to its goals of bringing old-school Final Fantasy into what was, at the time, the modern age. The music isn't reminiscent of the Final Fantasy style, but it does rely heavily on synthetic instrumentation, which gives it a chiptune-y feel that's sure to feel nostalgic to pre-CD audio RPG players. The visuals also made a great first impression. The muted pastels and stylized chibi character models helped to give the game its own appealing identity. I was especially impressed by the game's towns. Each one is built around a curve, which makes for some really interesting designs, like this spiraling tree, for example. From the moment I exited the hero's home to see these waves of grain blowing in the wind, I was sure that I would love this game's style. The presentation of the dungeons, though, made me question that love, as they quickly devolved into a series of long, featureless corridors. I found this not only boring, but a bit problematic when it came to the actual gameplay, but I'll get into that later. Much like the early Final Fantasy titles that Four Heroes pays homage to, story is not a priority, so I won't be making it a priority in my critique either. What little there is feels very much like it was written out of obligation as opposed to the desire to tell a tale. There are 4 heroes who start their adventure trying to save their hometown before it grows into an adventure to save the world. These characters are given personality, but only enough to give the writers an excuse to periodically separate them from each other. Whether it's one character nobly leaving a party member behind for their own safety, or another's lust for treasure driving them to explore on their own, you'll spend almost the entire first half of the game with a party of 2 or fewer members at your command. In a game with a class system, this is a huge problem, as it severely limits the player's creativity when constructing a party. You're almost always going to want a healer, especially since 4 heroes gives you a harsh inventory limit of 15 items per character, including their gear. This takes up one of your 2 free character slots, and your second slot will need to be some sort of DPS you can actually kill the enemies you run into. Once you reach the midway point of the game, where the party finally reunites and you can actually explore the class system, the enemy levels begin to scale with you, which discourages the player from growing stronger and actually experimenting with the combat and classes in the first place. Right away, I was able to tell that the game's structure did the class system no favors, but said system is by far the worst implemented I've ever seen in an RPG. You gain new classes periodically in the form of crowns, and you acquire them both through main story progression and side quests, which gives you the opportunity to slowly become more familiar with the different roles. This is standard fare, but the actual leveling of the classes is far from it. To upgrade each crown, you have to find a number of specific jewels to slot into them, which are dropped by enemies when you defeat them. The twist is that enemies don't drop money, they only drop jewels, and rarely consumable or equipable items that often don't sell for much. This means the only way the player can reliably get money is by selling some of the jewels they gather. And making jewels act as both your primary source of income and your only means of leveling up your crowns is a genius way of making the player really consider their options, but it doesn't last. You get an easy way of making infinite money only a few towns into the game, ruining the unique this versus that mechanic attached to the gems. The problems extend further though, as some of these gems are quite rare, as in only a handful in the entire game rare. That is, unless you exploit oversights in the game's design to get more than what was intended. Having to rely on finite resources to upgrade crowns when you don't know if their abilities will be useful or not turns into a gamble, and it's a gamble that I wasn't willing to take. And that's just the problem with leveling the crowns. The actual execution of the job system comes with its own plague of issues, the main one being that in a lot of ways the jobs you choose don't really matter. Gear is not restricted based upon the job you choose. Your white mage can wear plate mail and your paladin can wear robes. Weapons also aren't class locked, so my choice in who used what weapons and armor always boiled down to the highest attack power for the physical characters and the highest magic power for the mages. To be fair to 4 Heroes of Light, some jobs are labeled as performing better with specific weapons, but I never noticed a big enough difference in damage potential to choose a weaker weapon that the character is proficient with instead of just the weapon with the biggest number regardless of the type. The abilities you learn from the crowns are another issue. Each character has 6 slots to equip abilities for use in battle. Spells come from spell books, so any class can cast any spell in the game just by having the right items in their personal inventory. Each class has a maximum of 3 unique abilities it can learn, which can only be used when you're that specific class. These abilities range wildly in usefulness, from completely useless to overpowered. Even if you do have a character who knows all the abilities in a specific job, much of the time you'll really only be using 1 or 2 of them. After I leveled a couple crowns and realized I wasn't using most of the abilities, I stopped wanting to level them further because finding all the jewels I needed would be quite time consuming. Besides, the game never encouraged me to experiment anyway. By using very basic job classes, you can easily break the game. Both white and black mages get the innate ability to make casting their respective spell types cheaper, which, for the sake of their level 1 spells, Cure, Fire, Blizzard, etc., makes them essentially free to cast. Since those free spells are all I ever needed to get through the bulk of the game, I had absolutely no incentive to switch off of those classes. Another early game class, the Merchant, becomes literally invincible as long as you have enough gil, and given the infinite gil minigame I mentioned earlier, well, you can put 2 and 2 together. Bringing up balance in a game like this is usually pointless. I've said in the past that if all job classes were equal, then experimentation in class-based games wouldn't be fun. But 4 Heroes is so all over the place with the quality of its crowns that it feels as if the game was never even play-tested before release. Even if we disregard the crown system's effect on combat, which would be kind of pointless given how intrinsically tied together the two systems are, the combat just wasn't satisfying. Though I will admit that it wasn't for a lack of trying. The devs added a number of gimmicks in an attempt to make the combat feel unique. Unfortunately, none of them worked. First and foremost is that the player doesn't get to aim their character's attacks. Whenever you heal, the spell automatically targets the party member with the least health. Whenever you attack an enemy, almost all melee weapons hit the front row first, while long-range attacks like spells, bows, and spears hit the back row first. It is fairly intuitive and gets the job done most of the time. I don't recall ever being upset that my characters did one thing when I would have preferred them doing another, but on the other hand, I don't feel it did anything to enhance the game either. I found the best strategy was the simplest. Pick the weapons with the biggest numbers to attack with, regardless of who they aimed for, and sprinkle in whatever spell I could cast for free that the enemy wasn't resistant to. The game doesn't use an MP system. Instead, each ability has a cost between 1 and 5 ability points. You stock these points by taking a round to guard and charge up, forgoing an action now to use a more powerful one later. And I really like the idea of how the ability system is supposed to work. Having to store charges to make certain commands usable would ideally lead to a lot of planning and strategy. Having to stagger your party members attacking and defending to keep all of your members alive could have made for a really compelling combat system, but it doesn't work, primarily because the usefulness of each ability varies wildly, and many aren't worth using at all. I know I've had to bring this discussion up before in a couple of videos, but it all comes down to mathematics. Ultimately, you want to maximize your damage per ability point. So if using an ability that takes 1 ability point, and thus is essentially free because you get 1 ability point per round, does 100 damage, but using a level 2 ability which takes at least 1 turn of charging to use first only does 180 damage, then the second ability isn't worth using, because 2 turns of your level 1 spell would do 200 damage, which is greater than the 180 of the charged attack. Thankfully, the devs did account for this and made sure the damage scaling from one point to the next was significant enough to make the higher level abilities worth using. But that seems to be the only element of the ability point system they thought through, and ultimately it still doesn't work very well. The purpose of a system like this was presumably to create a bit of risk versus reward, but in 4 Heroes of Light there wasn't any. Every random encounter was so easy that I took them down with 1 or 2 hits of a 1 ability point action, so there's never a reason for me to ever use something stronger. On the contrary, every boss had me boosting until I maxed out my ability points so I could use my most powerful attacks. There was no middle ground where I had to make the tough decision between using a 2-point ability now or risk defending for a turn so I could use a 3-point ability the following round. The damage output of my 5-point abilities far outweighed the damage of cheaper ones when calculating out damage per point, so there was never a reason not to just save up all the points needed to use a powerful spell during boss fights. Since I always kept a white mage in my party that could cast Cure for free, I very rarely had to change my tactics even to heal. It didn't feel strategic to wait out these turns while I built up my ability points. It felt like I was wasting my time. The only element of the combat that I feel worked as intended was the use of elemental weaknesses. The damage boosts and reductions from using elemental weapons and armor were so large that having the right shield equipped for each boss fight became a necessity. The game goes so far as to show what element each character has on their equipped weapon around their portrait, which is a nice touch. Of course, even this falls away towards the mid and end game as strong non-elemental abilities become easier to come by, but in fairness, that's true of many JRPGs. The bottom line is that the execution of this game's crown system and combat were so poorly implemented that I question whether or not the devs understood the benefits of a job system in the first place. And things aren't much better outside of battle. Each town has a series of hidden treasures for the player to find, and by hidden I mean literally invisible. There's an NPC in each area that tells you how many there are and gives you hints as to where they are, but I found it much more efficient to simply run around hammering the A button until I'd uncovered them all. Even worse are the dungeons, which are often bare-bones mazes made difficult to navigate because of the combination of wide, uniform corridors and the zoomed-in camera. I can't stress enough how much the difference between this camera and this camera can affect the overall experience. Even comparing Final Fantasy III on DS to this shows a significant difference in scale, especially in cases like the Quicksand Castle where there are paths hidden in some of these whirlpools. Trying to navigate a map like this with this small of a viewing angle is a real pain in the ass, especially if you're trying to traverse them from memory. Though that traversing from memory may not be so difficult when you're forced to delve into most of the game's dungeons for a second time. Fans of my channel will know I hate this sort of padding in games, and when the route already wasn't fun the first time, well, you can imagine my pain. In case it somehow wasn't obvious, the core gameplay of 4 Heroes really didn't appeal to me, which made the bonus dungeons a task I had absolutely zero intentions of completing. 4 towers, each with 100 randomly generated floors that increase in size and complexity as you ascend, all to obtain 1 of 4 final job classes. I tapped out after the first dungeon, and frankly I'm surprised I even got through that one. The high encounter rate and the fact enemy levels scale with you gave me no incentive to actually fight the battles here, so I didn't. I ran away from every single fight excluding the bosses, which were required to be beaten every 10 floors or so. When the optimal strategy in a game becomes avoiding its primary gameplay mechanics, I consider that a massive failure. And that's 4 Heroes in a nutshell really, a game that systems are so poorly implemented that they encourage you not to interact with them. I've seen a lot of people argue that Final Fantasy The 4 Heroes of Light is a slog because it's old school to a fault, but I disagree. It is true that a lot of elements of RPGs from the NES and SNES era have not aged well. Cumbersome interfaces, opaque progression, a heavy reliance on grinding. None of these are problems I have with The 4 Heroes of Light. Every problem I have with the game stems from the new ideas and design decisions that 4 Heroes unsuccessfully brings to the table. A job system that discourages experimentation, an ability point system that undermines itself in its execution, maps that are made artificially difficult to traverse due to hardware limitations, items that are more often than not literally invisible when you are searching towns. I haven't played every NES RPG out there, but I don't remember these things being common issues of the era. When making a game, you can't just throw all of your cool ideas into a blender and hope it turns into something cohesive. You have to think about how the systems will interact. Everything that was supposed to make this game mechanically unique falls flat. And if you strip all of those elements away, you're left with a bland dungeon crawler with an uninspired story that I really don't think is worth most people's time. On the bright side, many JRPG fans should still be happy that 4 Heroes exists. It sold well enough that the dev team decided to take a second crack at it, and this sequel evolved into a brand new game which has spawned an entirely new JRPG series that you may have heard of, Bravely Default, which I won't be covering. Sorry, they aren't Final Fantasy games and I haven't beaten any of them yet, but I'm sure I'll end up trying the Bravely games out again someday, unlike 4 Heroes of Light, which I plan to never touch again. If you want to see Matrix Software do a nostalgic throwback, play the aptly titled Nostalgia. If you want to see Matrix Software succeed with some of their creative ideas, check out the incredibly unique Avalon code. Seriously, I picked this one up just to capture some footage for this video and I'm absolutely fascinated. It's not amazingly polished, but it's incredibly creative and I highly suggest giving it a shot if you're into atypical action RPGs. And if you want to see their take on Final Fantasy, well, you have a better job system with Final Fantasy III and a better adventure with Final Fantasy IV, both of which can also be found on the DS as well as smartphones and PC. Thank you all so much for watching. I'd of course like to take this opportunity to thank my very generous patrons. We have Caffeine, Charlotte, and of course, Gabe Nunez. If you enjoy my content and like to help me grow, you can always do the obvious. Every person on YouTube says it. Like, share, of course. And if you want to support me more directly, you can go onto my Patreon and donate. It's always very helpful. Thank you all so much. Hope you enjoy. Stay safe. Bye.